All right, I think we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll say good afternoon. I'm Jim New, the president of the Nevada Faculty Alliance, and I'm the president of Local 6766 at Truckee Meadows Community College in Reno. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping here. The Nevada Faculty Alliance is committed to providing an environment free from discrimination and harassment. We ask all participants here today to embrace those values of equity and equality and conduct themselves in a manner consistent with those values during today's discussion. At every NFA event, there is a designee as the first point of contact for anyone who thinks they have experienced discriminatory, harassing, or otherwise unacceptable behavior. We urge you to contact the designee if you have any concerns. Today's designee is Cheryl Cardoza, and you see her email address on the screen right now. Today has been designated by the American Association of University Professors as a National Day of Action for Higher Education, and our Shared Governance Summit is just one of numerous actions taking place on college and university campuses across the United States. These actions are designed to highlight the challenges confronting higher education and to reinforce the principles we value. I'd like to say thanks to all of you for helping to make this event a success. I'd like to say thanks especially to Regents Carol Del Carlo and Susan Brager, who we expect to join us today. They did confirm that they would participate, as well as President Kyle Dalpy from Western Nevada College, who is here. Our audience includes faculty senate chairs, student government leaders, and dozens of faculty from each of the NSHE colleges and universities. And I'd also especially like to thank my fellow NFA officers for enduring my manic phases as well as we pull all events like this together. Higher education in Nevada, as you all know, is at a crossroads. In November, voters will decide whether to open the door for the most sweeping changes to NSHE governance in the state's history, or to maintain the status quo. Ideological groups who have successfully managed to dismantle the foundations of shared governance in states like Florida and Texas have trained their sights on Nevada. Regardless of the path we follow, shared governance may be threatened. We are so fortunate to have Dr. Michael DeCesare join us today. Dr. DeCesare is a senior program officer in AAUP's Department of Academic Freedom, Tenure, and Governance, and a nationally recognized expert on academic governance. He holds a Master of Science in Sociology from Southern Connecticut State University and a PhD in Sociology from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He joined AAUP in 2022 after nearly 2 decades teaching sociology at Merrimack College and Cal State Northridge. Mike's job here today is to help us explore the principles behind shared governance, especially those outlined in AAUP's seminal 1966 statement on government of colleges and universities. After which, I hope we will have time for a candid discussion of how we protect shared governance in NSHE during a period of uncertainty. On the screen, I have a couple of QR codes that will take you to links on the AAUP statement, as well as an essay written by Dr. DeCesare on the principles of academic government. So with that, I will turn the table over to Dr. DeCesare and thank him for attending today, and we will have opportunities for questions a little later on.
Well, thank you for that great introduction, Professor New. Thank you for the invitation to come and talk with you and your colleagues today. I should have, it looks like I have screen sharing ability, so I will go ahead and do that. Thank you all for coming on what is kind of a historic day for higher education in this country. As Jim said, the National Day of Action, it really sprung up as a grassroots campaign from chapters across the country, and I'm very pleased to be a small part of that. Jim asked me to speak for a few minutes on principles of academic governance, AAUP recommended principles and standards of academic governance, and so I'll take maybe 35 minutes to do that, so we have plenty of time if there happen to be any questions that I can try and answer. I'll spend most of my time, as Jim just mentioned, talking about the Statement on Government of Colleges and Universities, which is the foundational document on academic governance in this country. But I would be remiss if I didn't at least touch on a few other topics, one of which is the relationship of faculty governance to academic freedom. As our statement of that title says, the two are inextricably linked. I think given the context, it makes sense to also at least touch on the statement on collective bargaining, which speaks a little bit to the relationship between collective bargaining and faculty governance, as does the statement on academic governance for institutions engaged in collective bargaining. That elaborates on some of the principles in our statement on collective bargaining. And then I thought it might be helpful to close with just by going over, 8, 10, 12 kind of practical steps that faculty can take to strengthen shared governance locally and even system-wide. And then finally, I have a slide at the end that has live links to all the different AAUP statements that I'll talk about. And I'd be happy to share this presentation with Jim afterward and Jim, feel free to distribute it as widely as you'd like, so people can have access to those links and to those documents if they'd like to look at them. From its founding 109 years ago, the AAUP has concerned itself with the faculty's role in institutional decision-making. The association's founding document, the 1915 Declaration of Principles on Academic Freedom and Academic Tenure, had this to say, and I won't read the whole quote to you, but I will point out at least the part in bold-faced type. The founders of the AAUP believe that the boards of trustees held an essential and highly honorable place in a university. But they also believe that the faculties held, quote, an independent place with quite equal responsibilities. In 2024, given what higher education looks like and has looked like for some decades now, that with quite equal responsibilities part might strike some of us as quaint, if not outright bizarre. We tend not to think of ourselves, and the same was true of me as a faculty member, as not having quite equal responsibilities as the trustees. We somehow see boards as above the faculty. That is not what the founders of the AAUP, that is not how they conceptualized the governance of colleges and universities. In addition to that, having quite equal responsibilities, the founders believed that in relation to purely scientific and educational questions, the faculty had, quote unquote, the primary responsibility. And that's a phrase that I'll come back to several times over the course of my remarks, primary responsibility. And I'll talk about what that means in just a little bit. So as I said from the start, the AAUP concerned itself not just with issues of academic freedom and tenure and due process, but with how institutions govern themselves and specifically the faculty's role in that self-governance. So we fast forward almost exactly 50 years to, and Jim mentioned this statement in his remarks, to the Statement on Government of Colleges and Universities, which, as I said a few minutes ago, is the authoritative formulation of principles and standards of academic governance. This statement is foundational for a number of reasons, not the least of which is that it was jointly formulated by the AAUP with the American Council on Education, which of course represents presidents, and the Association of Governing Boards of Universities and Colleges, which obviously represents governing boards. Each of those two groups commended it to its members. And as recently as 2017 or 2018, the AGB reaffirmed that, quote unquote, specific reference to the Statement on Government, quote, in the institution's governing documents is an important foundation for the institution's commitment to shared governance. We sometimes hear from board members and administrative officers, particularly, that the Statement on Government is kind of this, it's kind of like a black and white TV, right? It doesn't really serve any useful function anymore. After all, the thing is, almost 60 years old. And to that, we always tend to respond, well, it seems more important now than ever. given conditions for governance on so many campuses and across so many systems in this country. And we're very pleased to always point out that the national organization that represents boards of trustees and boards of regents saw fit very recently as 6 or 7 years ago, to reaffirm the importance of specifically referencing the statement in an institution's governing documents. It is far from obsolete. The statement is, I mean, it's this beautiful document. It's not long, but it does two things really well. The first thing it does is lays out kind of general principles and standards. And I'll talk about those in just a second. From there, it goes on to talk about quite specific responsibilities, areas of responsibility that each institutional component has. Regarding the first, those general principles and standards, the statement calls for adequate communication, shared responsibility, and joint planning and effort among the components of institutional government. I put joint planning and effort in boldface type in part, and shared responsibility in part because the statement never actually uses the phrase shared governance or shared government. That seemed to come into the lexicon later on. I'm not quite sure where, I haven't figured it out yet, but it is not in this statement. And one might argue, in fact, I've argued in the past, that the shift from the term academic governance, shared responsibility, joint planning and effort, to the term shared governance, there's some slippage there that I think may allow for administrative officers and board members to say, well, shared governance means, we all share in every single decision equally, when that is exactly not what the AAUP means by quote unquote shared governance. As I said, the second thing the statement does in a really useful way is it specifies areas of primary responsibility for the institutional component, specifically for the governing board, the administration, and the faculty. And it specifies areas of primary responsibility for each of those groups because the variety and complexity of the tasks performed by institutions of higher education produce, and this famous phrase, an inescapable interdependence among the board, administration, faculty, students, and others. And again, one could pretty easily argue, I think, that the variety and complexity of the tasks that our colleges and universities perform in 2024 are much greater than the variety and complexity of the tasks performed by colleges and universities in this country nearly 60 years ago, which again calls for a re-emphasis on adequate communication, shared responsibility, and joint planning and effort. The statement recommends joint governance because, quote, a college or university in which all the components are aware of their interdependence, of the usefulness of communication among themselves, and of the force of joint action will enjoy increased capacity to solve educational problems. And we all know very well the educational problems that confront today's colleges and universities. Again, there's that emphasis on the inescapable interdependence, the adequate communication, and that joint planning and effort. What appropriate joint planning and effort means is that all components get to participate in significant institutional decisions. The statement says important areas of action involve at one time or another the initiating capacity and the decision-making participation of all the institutional components. And you might say, well, okay, doesn't that mean that everybody has a seat at the table and an equal number of seats at the table and gets to participate in the same ways? No. Appropriate joint planning and effort requires participation depending on the degree of responsibility. As the statement says, differences in the weight of each component's voice should be determined by reference to the responsibility of each component for the particular matter at hand. So the weight of each voice is not the same across decision-making. It depends on the particular matter at hand. And that's where the statement goes into greater detail. It articulates the specific roles and responsibilities of the governing board, the administration, and the faculty. It also has a very small paragraph, 2 paragraphs, or 1 paragraph right at the end, on students' potential role in academic government. But the bulk of the statement by far articulates the role of these 3. Starting with the governing board, the statement asserts that it's the role of the board to ensure that the university stays true to its mission, plays a major role in ensuring that the institution has the financial resources it needs. The board members are the fiduciaries of the institution. And according to the statement, and this is something that faculty members don't always necessarily like to hear. I know I didn't like to hear it when I was a faculty member, but the board does possess final decision-making authority across all areas. There's a gigantic however in there that I'll come to in a minute. There it is. The board should undertake appropriate self-limitation. It's a short and simple sentence in the statement on government, but I think it speaks volumes that while the board maintains a general overview of the institution, it should undertake appropriate self-limitation by entrusting the conduct of administration to the president and the other administrative officers, and the conduct of teaching and research to the faculty, because that's where the faculty's collective expertise lies. The administration, the board, does not have the collective expertise in teaching and research that the faculty possesses. And it's for that simple reason that in those areas, authority should be delegated by the board to the faculty. I'll say more about that as we go along. The role of the president is to, quote, plan, to organize, to direct, and to represent the institution as its chief executive officer. Obviously, the president also in that role provides institutional leadership, and importantly, it ensures effective communication between the components of the institution. Arthur Lovejoy, one of the founders of the AAUP, famously compared the board and the faculty at any institution to like the 2 ends of an hourglass. And that thin band in the middle where the sand flows through was the president's office. And Lovejoy thought this is not a good arrangement, where the only conduit between these two groups of equal importance and equal responsibility, don't forget, have to go through the office of the president to communicate with each other. And so for Lovejoy and others, the ideal was to have direct communication between the faculty and the board. And in fact, to this day, our policy standards reflect that belief. And I can talk more about that during the Q&A if people are interested. However it happens, the role of the president is to facilitate communication between those 2 components. And also the president ensures that the operation of the institution, and this is important too, conforms to 2 things. First, the policies that are set forth by the board, but also to sound academic practice. And the president's responsibility for ensuring both of those things gets reflected in the fact that the president, as the 3rd point on this slide says, should be equally qualified to serve both as the executive officer of the board and as the chief academic officer of the institution and the faculty. Increasingly, we've seen, I'd say over the last 2, maybe 3 decades, probably closer to 3 decades, the appointment of presidents who are qualified to serve as the executive officer of the governing board by virtue of typically corporate experience, but are not necessarily qualified to serve as a chief academic officer of an institution of higher education and its faculty. I guess the example that always immediately comes to mind is the University of Iowa's presidential search back in 2014-15, when the eventual appointee was a former IBM executive and had virtually no academic experience whatsoever. And the faculty at the University of Iowa were up in arms about the appointment, not only because the search turned out to be kind of a sham, he was an inside candidate, but also because they claimed he was not qualified to serve as the chief academic officer of the University of Iowa or its faculty. The president obviously is also largely responsible for maintaining existing institutional resources and creating new ones, according to the statement, fundraising, and has managerial responsibility for a large area of non-academic activities, such as student affairs, athletic programs, etc. The president, in that dual role, and again, the position has changed such that sometimes we tend not to think of it as a dual role anymore. But according to this statement, it is and should be. That dual role of executive officer of the board and an academic officer of the institution, in those dual roles, the president should have the confidence of both of those components. That also was a problem at the University of Iowa back 9 or 10 years ago. So what about the faculty? Well, consistent with the general principles laid out in the statement, the faculty should have primary responsibility, which means voice and decision-making authority. More on that in a second. For matters in proportion to the degree of their expert knowledge. It follows from that, as the statement says, the faculty has primary responsibility for such fundamental areas as curriculum, subject matter and methods of instruction, research, faculty status, and those aspects of student life which relate to the educational process. Faculty status is an area that includes appointments, reappointments, decisions not to reappoint, promotions, the granting of tenure, dismissal, I would throw post-tenure review in there, decisions in those areas, including decisions to establish or revise policies, institutional policies in these areas, should be the faculty's primary responsibility, according to the statement. And again, I'll just reiterate, I promise for the last time, that this statement was a joint formulation. This wasn't the AAUP kind of, foisting this on higher education in this country. It came with, it was a joint formulation with the ACE and the AGB. So that phrase that I've used a few times, what does primary responsibility actually mean? The statement is quite clear, actually. And in a couple of different places, it says what primary responsibility means. Here's one of those places. On those matters on the previous slide, the power of review or final decision lodged in the governing board or delegated by it to the president should be exercised adversely only in exceptional circumstances and for reasons communicated to the faculty. Further, it's desirable that the faculty should, following such communication, have opportunity for further consideration and further transmittal of its views to the president or board. In other words, in a decision regarding, say, the granting of tenure, faculty committees recommend a candidate for tenure. The provost says no, or the president says no, or the board says no. That should not be the end of the story. That power should be exercised adversely only in exceptional circumstances and for reasons communicated to the faculty. And then there's that other step after that. Put another way, according to the statement, in those areas of faculty primacy, boards and presidents should, quote, concur with faculty judgment except in rare instances and for compelling reasons, which should be stated in detail. It is simply not acceptable under AAUP recommended governance standards for an administration or governing board to take an adverse decision in contradiction to a faculty decision in any area of the faculty's primary responsibility, except under extraordinary circumstances or rare instances. And in those instances, the administration or board needs to provide compelling reasons in detail. And the faculty should have the opportunity for further consideration and further transmittal of its views. That's what the AAUP means by shared governance. Not that everybody has a seat at the table and the faculty get to say what they want, but then the administration makes the decision anyway. That is not the same thing. In addition, the faculty should have oversight over admissions, according to the statement. We tend to think with admissions offices on every campus in the country, we just tend to think that, the admissions officers take care of that stuff, right? Admissions requirements and which students get in and which ones don't. Who's in a better position? Who has more collective expertise in the question of who should be admitted to a college or university based on academic credentials than the faculty? I would argue no one, and certainly not admissions officers. But with the bureaucratization of higher education in this country, we have come to rely on admissions offices, and therefore kind of forget that that's an area of the faculty's primary responsibility, as is setting requirements for degrees and determining when those degree requirements have been set, again, based on the faculty's collective expertise. We have registrar's offices, of course, on every campus in the country. We kind of turn that over to them, just as we turn oversight over admissions to admissions offices. Again, in the process, forgetting that this is something that the faculty should ultimately have primary responsibility for. Working in conjunction with admissions officers and staff in the registrar's office, sure, but ultimately, it should be the faculty's decision in these areas. Even in those areas where the faculty doesn't have primary responsibility, in other words, doesn't have the collective expertise to be an authoritative voice, the faculty should still participate meaningfully in decision-making. So strategic planning, or what the statement called long-range planning, what we call strategic planning now, the faculty need to be meaningfully involved in that. If for no other reason that it's the faculty who typically have the longest tenure at an institution. Board members come and go, presidents and deans come and go. Faculty, especially tenured faculty members, stay much longer. They have much more at stake and invested in a strategic plan, especially one of 5 or 10 years. The faculty should also be meaningfully involved in decision-making about facilities on campus. Who is in a better position to explain what's necessary for a new building, or a new classroom building, or the renovation of existing lab space, or the renovation of existing classroom space, than the people who actually use those spaces every day, namely professors? Does the faculty need to be meaningfully involved in deciding what kind of shrubbery to plant outside the administrative building? No. But classroom space, lab space, performance space for theater and dance, of course, those are essentially curricular matters tied up in physical space. Budgetary matters, including salary matters. We have a separate statement on the faculty's role in budgetary and salary matters. The faculty should be meaningfully involved at every level of that process, including, according to that statement on the role of the faculty in budgetary and salary matters, in decisions about the overall budget of the institution and decisions about the budget that's allocated to different units or components of the institution, also including faculty salaries. There should be a standing faculty committee under our standards that has access to essentially all the same financial reports and data that the administration has in determining budgets and salaries. And finally, we also have another derivative statement on the hiring and retention and evaluation of administrators. And that statement also claims a meaningful role for the faculty in decisions in those areas, particularly decisions in those areas when it comes to administrators who are, as a former administrator of mine used to say, on the academic side of the house. So the provost, the dean of the faculty should be meaningfully involved in decisions about the appointment of those individuals, their retention, and their evaluation. Does the faculty need to be as meaningfully involved in the search for the vice president of finance or the vice president of communication? No, not under our standards. But on the academic side, definitely. What this all boils down to, that what I call here the essence of the traditional conception of governance, is that all voices on campus are not equal in institutional government. Academic governance is not a democracy. Not everybody has the same vote. Instead, the faculty exercises primary responsibility in its areas of expert knowledge. And in those areas, the administration and board should normally concur with the faculty's recommendations. In other words, when it comes to academics, a faculty decision should normally be a final decision. And I feel like, well, I don't know, the phrase "sound like a broken record," I guess, is kind of outdated now, but I do feel like one when I say that what it boils down to is that it's the faculty that has the collective expertise to make the most informed decisions and judgments in these areas, not the board or the administration. I remember some years ago giving a similar talk at a small college in Massachusetts, and during the question and answer, a person in the audience stood up and she said, I don't understand why you think the faculty should make decisions about tenure and promotion. That should be my decision as the dean. And I said, but as the dean, I said, you have collective expertise in one particular, or you have expertise in one discipline, one area of study, yes? And she said, yes. And I said, well, how could you be qualified then to judge a tenure application from a faculty member in your school who's in an entirely different discipline? Wouldn't you agree that it makes more sense for the faculty members in that department to make the decision, the judgment, because they have the collective expertise rather than your expertise as an individual? And I was very pleased and surprised, of course, when she said, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. I hadn't thought about it. And I said, well, it's right there in the statement on government. We've just gotten so entrenched in this structure where the dean makes the decision, or the provost makes the decision, or the president makes the decision, that we forget that a lot of this is just kind of common sense. In yet other words, the administration and board, for the same reason, should maintain a hands-off policy under normal circumstances with regard to any academic matter, including all those areas that I had several slides ago. As I said at the beginning, I would be remiss if I didn't at least touch on the relationship of faculty governance to academic freedom. The two, according to our statement on the relationship of faculty governance to academic freedom, are quote unquote inextricably linked. On the one hand, maintaining academic freedom, ensuring its existence on campus, requires the faculty to participate meaningfully in governance. If there is no faculty committee on tenure and promotion, for example, how can there be said to be academic freedom on campus if administrative officers are making the decision about who's granted tenure and promotion and who's not? That would seem to be a situation that is ripe for academic freedom violations, for a dean or a provost or a president to say, well, this candidate seems strong, but I don't like what they teach in the classroom, or I don't like what they conduct research on. It's too controversial, so we're going to deny them tenure and or promotion. At the same time, the faculty's participation in governance is protected by academic freedom, what we call intramural speech. The faculty has the right and are protected by academic freedom to criticize institutional policies, to criticize the institution, to criticize administrative officers' decisions. Those activities are protected by academic freedom. Do faculty members have the right to flout institutional policy? No. Do faculty members have the right under academic freedom to disregard the rules of the institution? No, as long as they don't contravene academic freedom. But at the same time, faculty members absolutely do have the right to be critical of those policies and to seek revision of them. And so that, it's the proverbial two-way street between the faculty's role in governance and faculty having academic freedom. The best protection of academic freedom, and by extension of governance, of course, is tenure. Given the audience today, I thought it would also might be helpful to just say a word about the statement on collective bargaining. And by say a word, I mean reproduce this quotation from that statement, which emphasizes, as the entire statement does, that faculty governance and collective bargaining are by no means like mutually exclusive or in some kind of conflict with each other. The AAUP has never perceived of collective bargaining in such a way. Instead, what we have long maintained is that the presence of institutions of faculty governance, a faculty senate, for example, does not preclude the need for or usefulness of collective bargaining. On the contrary, and I added this emphasis, collective bargaining can be used to increase the effectiveness of those institutions of faculty governance by extending their areas of competence, by defining their authority clearly, and by strengthening their voice in areas of shared authority and responsibility. One of the things I've been surprised by since joining the national staff is that to find that there are campuses out there where there's a conflict, a kind of an enduring conflict between, collective bargaining and faculty governance. And for me, not really coming from a collective bargaining background, it's been difficult to understand, because from the AAUP's perspective, the two are hand in glove. They're trying to achieve the same ends. The primary one of which is, a stronger faculty voice in institutional decision making. And that's what is elaborated upon in our statement on academic government for institutions engaged in collective bargaining. It takes some of those principles from the statement on collective bargaining and draws a little bit more out of them. It's quite explicit. Collective bargaining should not replace, but rather should ensure effective traditional forms of shared governance. And it concludes with the second quotation on this slide, which has always struck me as kind of poignant. When legislatures, judicial authorities, boards, administrations, or even faculty members act on the mistaken assumption that collective bargaining is somehow incompatible with collegial governance, they do a grave disservice to the very institutions they seek to serve. as I said, the two efforts from the AAUP's perspective should go hand in hand. Just briefly, and a lot of this is, I'm sure, preaching to the choir, but just some practical steps faculty can take to strengthen shared governance. It's sometimes a good place to start just by analyzing conditions for governance on your campus or across the system. What are the strengths and weaknesses of how you do things? The AAUP has this really helpful governance assessment tool, which is available on our website, and I have a link to it on the penultimate slide of this presentation, that you can use to gauge not only the faculty's respective roles in decision-making on campus, but how your campus stacks up compared to national data collected by our research department. It's also always a good idea to compare your governance practices with the standards I've talked about, today, those set forth in the Statement on Government and derivative AAUP policy statements on governance. Hold public forums just like this one on governance with, campus speakers, outside speakers. The more you talk about governance and the importance of it, the more you tend to draw other faculty members into it. You start to come to a shared understanding with administrative officers and board members who attend those sessions. On a related note, actively seek out opportunities to talk about governance with the administration and the governing board. I know I've known a few faculty members over the years who have told me that in their capacity as AAUP chapter presidents, they've anytime a new president joined the institution, they would ask for a meeting with the president, and they would present the president with a copy of the Red Book as kind of a welcome gift, and say, anytime you want to talk about what's in here, not just about governance, but academic freedom, tenure, due process, collective bargaining, it's all in. I mean, this is the gold standard. So anytime you want to talk, let's talk about it, because it can only benefit the institution. Maybe more kind of nuts and bolts, ground level stuff. Make sure that standing faculty committees exist for all those areas that involve academic decisions. Another thing I've been somewhat surprised by is how many institutions out there do not have like a faculty grievance committee or, committees that like a curriculum committee. They just kind of leave it to ad hoc committees or administrative officers. Always question the advisability of mixed committees in areas of faculty primacy. And by mixed committees, I mean committees that are composed of a combination of faculty members and administrative officers and staff members and maybe students. They simply, it's not a criticism of those other groups. It's not any kind of knock on them, but they don't have the collective expertise. I promised I wouldn't say this again, but I guess I'm breaking it now. They don't have the collective expertise that the faculty has in educational matters and academic matters. Also avoid the use of ad hoc committees, task forces, blue ribbon panels, whatever we call them, especially if they're established unilaterally by the administration or the board. We saw this especially at the height of COVID and the immediate wake of COVID, this establishment by the administrations of many institutions across the country of these kind of pop-up committees with hand-picked faculty members and administrative officers and whoever else that started to make decisions that previously resided with faculty committees. And that isn't good for faculty governance or for the institution. Ensure that faculty appointments to all committees, any committee that has faculty members on it, faculty representatives, those faculty representatives should be appointed by the faculty, ideally elected by the faculty, but if worse comes to worse, at least appointed by, say, the Faculty Senate Executive Committee. We've seen an increase in the use of non-disclosure agreements or confidentiality agreements as a condition for participating in shared governance, especially in faculty's participation in things like presidential searches or searches for provosts or deans. They're told that they need to sign an NDA if they want to be a member of the committee, and that should be strongly protested, or at the very least questioned by the faculty, the rationale for it and the so-called necessity of it. And establish expectations for the conduct of your representatives on different committees. At a very minimum, faculty representatives need to inform their constituents and seek input from their constituents in the work that they're doing. If they can't even do that because of an NDA or some other condition of their service, then they can't truly be called representatives of the faculty. They might be committee members, but if they can't talk to the group that they purport to represent and can't seek their input, can't let them know how the process is unfolding, can't say anything to them, then they're not really representing them at all. And finally, and this may seem like an odd one, but it's kind of a hobby horse of mine, get involved in writing accreditation self-studies. You know, and I say this with some pause, because the faculty's participation in governance assumes on some level that faculty members have almost an unlimited supply of time and energy. Like, you have to teach, you have to produce scholarship and creative activity. And then there's this third category called service, typically. And within that is where we put governance. And on top of everything else a faculty member is responsible for, it's really hard to find the time to participate meaningfully in governance. Just, you know, the day-to-day grind of on-campus governance, let alone, oh, you're undergoing accreditation this year, why don't you volunteer for one of the self-study groups and help to write that section of the report for the accrediting body? It's really hard to find the time for that. I totally understand. But it's also, it's another way to get the faculty's voice out there, and in this instance to an external agency, you know, about what governance looks like on campus and where it can be improved. And then finally, always question the use of quote unquote closed searches for administrators. Colorado in particular has been on my mind lately, because they've just done one closed search after another for chancellor, for president. I think there have been 3 now in succession, where they just kind of announce who the appointee is without giving the faculty any chance, without having given the faculty any chance to meet with finalists, to even know who the finalists were, to talk with them and interview them. That's not only not good for the faculty and the institution, I would argue that it's also not good for the appointee to have never met with the faculty of the institution they're about to preside over, other than those few members who might be on the search committee. It sets up the appointee in an unfavorable and unenviable and unfair position, I think, to do that. As I said, these should all be live links. Each one should take you to the policy document that it actually is linked to. That last one obviously is not a policy document. That's the shared governance assessment tool that I mentioned a few slides back. And I'll be, as I said at the opening, Jim, I'll be glad to send this to you, this presentation to you tomorrow morning, and please feel free to share it as widely as you like, not just with the faculty, but with board members and administrative officers. And if anybody runs into trouble with any of those links, please do let me know. And do let our department know if you have any questions, concerns, need assistance with anything regarding AAUP policy standards on not only governance, but academic freedom, due process, anything that's covered in the 80+ policy documents in the Red Book, or elsewhere on the AAUP website. Our department, my colleagues and I, we're the policy arm of the association. So please don't ever hesitate to contact us with questions or assistance or concerns anytime at academicfreedom@aaup.org. And with that, I'll stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take any questions, or Jim, if you have something else you'd like to do next.
Well, absolutely. And thank you so much for this, Mike. It's been very informative. And I did my best as you were making your presentation in grabbing the links. I would look them up to the various statements, and I posted those in the chat.
Oh, thank you. Great.
So we do have those, and I'll look forward to receiving the presentation, and I will post that on our website as well. We do have a question. I believe this is Lars Jensen. It says Jensen, so I'm assuming it's Lars. And then I see Patrick Villa has his hand up too. So we'll go first to Mr. Jensen. I assume it's Lars.
Yeah. I have a question. I was wondering what you think about the dean having to approve department policies. We have a situation where the dean approves department policies, and these are any policy the department may put forth and approve. And oftentimes they're purely academic policies that affects the quality of education, maybe enrollment, maybe placement scores, that kind of thing. And we have a situation where deans frequently will, or very often, won't approve those policies if they interfere with enrollment rates and pass rates and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, where those policies bear on those areas of primary responsibility that I had up earlier, policies regarding curriculum, policies regarding admission standards, or the adequacy of test scores to place out of certain courses, policies regarding tenure and promotion within the department. Those should be the faculty, the departmental faculty's primary responsibility. The dean should not be, under our standards, kind of unilaterally overriding departmental decisions in those areas. And if the dean feels the need to, once again, it should be in rare instances and for reasons that should be communicated to the department, and then the department faculty should have an opportunity to kind of go back at the dean and say, this is why we continue to disagree. And as I said earlier, it shouldn't be a case where, I think I used the tenure and promotion example, but the same principle applies here. It shouldn't be the case where a department faculty establishes a policy or revises a policy, submits it to the dean for approval, and the dean simply says, no, you're not going to implement that, and that's the end of the story. That should not be the case under widely accepted principles of academic governance. So in those areas where the faculty should have primary responsibility, I would say that no, the dean should not be unilaterally vetoing department decisions.
Okay, thank you. Patrick?
Hey, thank you for coming in and sharing all this with us. It's nice to hear. My question is a couple things. When you were talking about, obviously, the big picture of shared governance, you were talking about academic freedom, and you mentioned the definitions, and the issue I come across is when our administration has subjectively different definitions of both of those, and oh no, that is part of academic freedom, that is not part of it, that's not covered, and there's no tiebreaker, there's no mediator. It just sort of becomes, well, this is what general counsel said, this is what the president, the dean said, and I find that a lot of us have a lack of appeal. We can't appeal to anybody. It's this is what they've defined them. And you were talking about your definition, and I'm assuming you're talking about how the AAUP defines them. And what I find at CSN is we lose because the Red Book is not official. It's not anywhere in ANSHI. It goes back to, well, our policies don't say that. Our policies don't have this. Our bylaws don't have that. And what do you recommend when we're facing this kind of a fight or an issue?
Yeah, great question. First, I would say you're absolutely right, and the administration is right that you have institutional policies. They may or may not comport with what's in here, but this represents, and I don't say this I don't want to sound like arrogant in some way because I work for this organization, but this is the gold standard in higher education. The AUP has survived for 109 years for a reason. We're not an accrediting agency, so we don't have that kind of leverage. We rely on our reputation and on reasoned, principled argumentation, scholarly argumentation, and we rely on moral suasion to get administrations to agree to bring their policies, institutional policies, in line with our recommended standards. If they simply say, that's not our policy and the AUP holds no sway here, I mean, I guess my gut reaction to that as a faculty member, and I used to hear it, was always, well, the most reputable institutions in the country adhere to the stuff that's in this book. So are we one of those or not? Does Merrimack want to be one of those or not? And if not, fine. I'll take this and go back to my office and you won't hear from me again. But if it does, I think we should pay attention to what's in here and try to bring our policies into line with it, or nobody's going to take this college seriously. And I mean, it's especially when it comes to governance, not so much, although with academic freedom, it's becoming this too. But with governance, it seems like it's always been the faculty plays defense. The faculty is forced to play defense all the time and defend like its right to make decisions about curriculum or basic, those fundamental areas of primary responsibility. When in reality, it's just common, it is kind of common sense. So the other thing you said that's important, I think, is you mentioned, general counsel, and more what we've seen is the encroachment into areas of faculty primacy under the rationale of, well, faculty counsel, this is what general counsel says has to happen. This is what general counsel says is permissible and not permissible under the law. Or this is what human resources says is permissible. This is what human resources says we have to do. And the response to that is always, well, okay, then get them in front of the faculty to tell us that. I want to know exactly what law would be broken by the establishment of this particular policy on student absences. I want to know what statute would be violated specifically in state law by this proposed policy and 9 times out of 10 what we see is that they can't produce that evidence. It's kind of a convenient cover. So just kind of, I don't like the phrase push back, but that's really, I think, what you have to just kind of oppose that at every turn and say, well, give us some evidence for that. We're scholars. I'm open to evidence, that supports your position, but show it to me, because I don't just believe you on the face of it. I can't. I don't know if that's...
Thank you. No, that's
sure.
That's what I wanted to hear. Just something like that. I appreciate you sharing that. I appreciate it. Take care.
Sure,
thanks, Patrick. And next, I'd like to recognize the 2024 AAUP recipient of the Outstanding Achievement Award, a man who doesn't, as bright as he is, he can't seem to comprehend the definition of retirement. Kent Irvin, the past president of NFA. Kent.
Well, thank you for that, Jim, and thank you, Mike, for a really interesting presentation. But you apparently, I'm also clairvoyant because you just answered my question about general counsels and their role, or at least partially answered it. I was going to refer to the recent Chronicle and Higher Education article on your college's top lawyer has never been more powerful.
Yeah.
Maybe you could say, what should the role of the general counsel be within the I doubt general counsel was actually mentioned much in these 60-year-old documents because the role seems to have expanded more recently, but where is their role?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question for me to answer, just because I'm not aware of any association policy standards that speak specifically to the role of a general counsel, or to a human resources department for that matter, because our standards speak to the role of faculty members in institutional decision making, and that's pretty much it. What I would say though, is that again, we've seen this increasing encroachment by legal, as so many institutions like to call it, into areas of faculty primacy, and that simply shouldn't happen, and under our standards. And when it does happen, I think it's incumbent on the faculty to call it out for what it is, encroachment by somebody who does not have the expertise to encroach in those areas. But no, we don't have any specific policy that speaks to what their role should be. But if we extrapolate from the standards in the Statement on Government, then we can say it should not be to dictate decisions in the faculty's traditional areas of primacy. Yeah.
And what about the other two parts, the president's responsibility and the governing board's responsibility? Because we seem to see legal having roles there too.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, as a member of the institution's administration, the president has the right to delegate to general counsel certain responsibilities that the president otherwise might have under the Statement on Government. And I suppose that the board could also delegate to the general counsel under those same standards certain responsibilities for the day-to-day administration of the institution. But I would like to think, although just about all the evidence is to the contrary, I'd like to think that presidents and boards would encourage general counsels to also undertake appropriate self-limitation in what they get themselves involved with on campus. I don't think that happens, but I'd like to hope that it does somewhere. But it's a really interesting question though about what a president and a board would permit a general counsel to get involved with, or to, kind of take control of. And I hadn't thought about it that much, but I hadn't thought about it at all actually until you asked it. But those are just thoughts off the top of my head about that.
If I may follow up on that, I think one of the things that we've seen happening increasingly, I've been here 26 years, and just it seems like over the last 10 years, the general counsel at each institution has evolved into more of an office for the defense of the administration rather than for the benefit of the institution. And partially, if I'm not mistaken, it may be because I believe the presidents play a role in evaluating the general counsel. Therefore, obviously, the general counsel is going to have a primary objective of keeping his evaluator happy. Are there other models out there?
Oh, not that I'm aware of, Jim. And I hadn't really thought about the chain of command and the president evaluating the general counsel either, until you just mentioned that. No, I'm not aware of any other models. Typically, in my experience, the general counsel is either a member of the president's office or has their own office of general counsel and their own staff. At smaller institutions like the one I was at for 16 years, the general counsel was a member of the president's staff and did report directly to the president, although I don't know what the evaluation process looked like. At larger institutions, of course, there's a separate office of general counsel. And I don't know what the interface is between that office and the office of the president. Like I said, I can't speak intelligently on this because we don't have any standards to govern that particular role.
Thank you. We do have Christine asking a question in the chat, and her question is, do you have definitions for the assessment tool descriptors? For example, faculty primacy or joint authority? And Christine, I see that you just turned your video back on. Did you have anything else to ask on that?
No, I'm just looking at it, and I'm considering having, I chair our Academic Freedom and Ethics Faculty Senate Committee, and I'm thinking this might be a fun exercise is to go through this tool. But I know immediately the folks that sit on my committee are going to say, what do these descriptors mean?
I'm trying to open it up for myself here, and I'm pretty sure there are definitions provided on like the first or second page of that.
Okay, I went through it quickly, but maybe I missed it. Sorry about that.
No, not at all. Let me for some reason the link isn't working. And did the link work for you in the presentation? Because it's not working for me.
No, it was in the chat. That's where I got it from.
Okay, right. I'm just pulling up the tool now, and on the second page,
Okay.
the second page is titled definitions. And so there's a definition for dominance, primacy, joint authority.
My apologies.
No,
Thank you.
not at all. Not at all. That should help.
That'll take care of it. Beautiful. Thank you so
Great.
much.
Sure thing.
I don't see any hands up right now. Oh, there we go. Peter Reed, chair of the UNR Faculty Senate.
Yeah, I was waiting till I could just put my hand up and jump right in. So first off, Dr. DeCesare, thank you so much for this presentation. I listened very intently, and it's a lot to reflect on and digest, I think. So thank you so much for that. And my question is that I was particularly taken by the articulation of the different areas of primary responsibility and how those are tied to respective subject matter expertise, right, for different folks. And I'm curious to know if you have any suggestions for how faculty can, or an entire campus community together, can productively cultivate a healthy mutual respect for the respective primary areas of responsibility. So, because I mean, obviously, there are areas of academics that administration gets engaged in, and perhaps areas of administration that faculty are getting engaged in, and there's a tendency for scope creep across those areas. And how do we draw those lines, recognizing that everyone should have a voice in all the elements, but that there are areas of primary responsibility that should be honored?
It's a good question as well. I think I think it can be accomplished in some of the ways I talked about toward the end of the presentation, especially like regular communication between the faculty and the administration and the board about, who should own what, who should own which area, and then, but also why they should own that area. Like the president and the board have every right to say, we kind of own the area of fundraising. We'd like the faculty to be involved in that to the extent that they're able and willing to be. But when it comes to raising money for the institution, we should be primarily responsible for that. And, I understand that completely. At the same time, they should understand the faculty's argument that when it comes to curriculum, we should be responsible for that because that's what we know how to do really well. Just like we know subject matter and methods of teaching, methods of instruction really well. We know research really well and faculty status really well, better than you do as board members or administrative officers. So I guess for me, as useful as the detail of the primary responsibilities are in the statement, I find myself tending to come back to the more general principles of and emphasizing them in talking with administrators and board members of joint effort and planning. Like, it's not going to work if the board insists on making unilateral decisions all the time. It's not going to work if the president insists on making unilateral decisions all the time. There's always going to be conflict and tension if that's the approach they want to take. So let's focus on joint effort and planning, because that's what's best for the institution and it's what's best for the students at the institution. Let's focus on regular and adequate communication, because that's what's best for the institution and its students. And let's focus on, derivative things like transparency and working together, presumably. And this is, governance, isn't this amorphous thing? Like, it happens every day on campus, and it's manifested in a million different ways every day on campus. And if the components would just talk to each other more frequently and more frankly and more directly, it can work much better than it typically does. Will you run up against an obstinate president or an obstinate dean or an obstinate board member or an obstinate faculty member? Of course. But governance structures can help you kind of bypass those individual personality things and focus on what really matters, which is the long-term well-being of the institution, the education of the students, and the fact that the board, the administration, and the faculty all have the same interests at heart, I think, I hope. And if that can be conveyed, when that can be conveyed to the administration and the board, I think that produces much more fertile ground for productive working relationships. It's easy, and it was easy for me as a faculty member to go back to my corner and say, they don't listen to anything. I'm not even going to engage with these people. And then when I needed to engage, to kind of come out swinging. When in fact, governance seems to work better when it's a give and take. And I don't mean give away areas of faculty primary responsibility, be firm on that, but also be, teach them about why it's important. I once had a senior colleague tell me that we should all be more like professors when it comes to governance. And I said to her, what do you mean? And she said, well, we teach all day long. We teach our students all this stuff. Why can't we teach administrators and board members, when we have the opportunity, what governance should look like and why it's important that the faculty has this role and the board has this role? And it was an epiphany for me. And that's the approach I tried to take when I found myself in those situations. I don't know if that answers your question at all, Peter, but it's just kind of what came to mind.
I find that really helpful. Thank you. And particularly that area of, even if there's an area of primary responsibility where someone may have the ultimate kind of decision-making authority, it's that joint engagement that really helps that to succeed, and that collaborative leadership where people are able to communicate effectively and hear each other and work together effectively. Even the example you used of fundraising, right? For me, it's like, okay, it's easy to say, well, we want faculty to be engaged in fundraising, but that's the role of the board and the administration. But then they're going out and raising funds where donors are giving things with specific intentions. Yeah. And how do they define what those intentions will be? And that should be by engaging faculty to identify what the needs on the campus are, right? So even though there may be that ultimate authority for the final decision, the engagement is what makes that decision best informed, right?
Yes. Yep. Exactly. Yep. I agree.
Okay, we have Glinda White with her hand raised. Glinda?
Yes, thank you for sharing. I just want to make a couple of comments. And I also have a question in reference to this issue of general counsel and everything being referred to them. And so administration stands behind that in terms of a decision. I think what I have observed, and just for the record, I'm at CSN, the College of Southern Nevada, and I've been here 33 years. So my observation is based upon participatory experience with various administrations. And at this point, with the current administration, where we have increasingly seen more of just a simple question raised referred to general counsel, and general counsel being upfront and out front, and of course, administration standing behind that. So the question in reference to that is, I know you're dealing with the shared governance area. Would it not behoove all of us as institutions to reach out to other areas of AAUP, primarily the legal, to provide us at least with some guidelines in reference to what an adequate response should be when we get that canned scripted response from the administration? My experience indicate that governance, negotiations, discussions only work when parties come to any table in good faith and in good conscience. It is regrettable to say that at this institution, that is not always adhered to. So I think we need something more. I know we do at my institution, to be able to provide not only I wrote your words, a reasoned principle based on reputation and based upon the standards of AAUP, because sadly, we are beyond that. And so that's why I'm asking, would it not be in our best interest to go further, to maybe reach out to legal, not with any type of legal document, but certainly with some guidance and directions as to what those responses should be, because we know we're going to get that scripted answer.
Yeah, that's a really good question too. And I'm sorry to hear the situation at CSN is how you described it. I guess, I'm not an attorney, but I think your idea to seek advice, some kind of legal counsel in terms of how to respond to, well, I need to send this to general counsel. Well, general counsel says this or says that. That sounds like a sound strategy to me as a non-lawyer. But I also have to say that, regrettably, the AUP's legal department doesn't provide advice to individual faculty members. It's, kind of in-house counsel. So if you were to contact them, what their advice to you would be is to contact either the State Board Association, or there's another group that we typically send people who inquire about legal advice to. And that group, if you'll forgive me, is called the National Employment Lawyers Association. That's a professional organization of attorneys who represent employees in like employment law cases. And so that organization or the State Bar Association might be able to recommend somebody to talk with about how to effectively respond when the administration says, well, this is for general counsel. The other thing I would add is, I think a better a better place for an inquiry, like a better place to send an inquiry like that than our legal department would be our Department of Organizing and Services. They are they're the just like we're the policy arm of the association, they're the organizing arm. So they can, they're in the best position to advise you and your colleagues about kind of effective strategies to counter the administration's response of, well, no, this is for general counsel to deal with. They can advise you about, you know, some tactics to use to counter that narrative.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. We
Sure,
appreciate that.
sure. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. No other hands raised. I will ask a question. When I was reading your article on reaffirming the principles of shared governance, you described several scenarios of how shared governance may be treated on campus, or the semblance of shared governance, let me say. And I think one of the things that I've seen most frequently, not just at my campus, as the president of the state association, I've spotted it happening on other campuses as well, are administrators handpicking faculty leaders that they want to work with and positioning them for faculty leadership positions, and then engaging primarily, sometimes only, with those individuals, and then calling it shared governance. And it can be extremely frustrating. I think it's harmful to those people who are members of our faculty and are part of the community. And it's very difficult to break through that noise sometimes when they tell, you know, the community that they are working in shared governance, but they're only working with the people they want to hear from.
Yeah, yeah.
How do you deal?
Yeah, good question, Joe. The so-called kitchen cabinet of
Right.
some administrator somewhere. I think one way to try to deal with it is to hold those faculty members accountable to, in the same way that the faculty would pressure the administration for transparency and accountability, the faculty members who are appointed to those positions need to face that same pressure from the larger faculty, because they are, whether they realize it or not, you know, in those positions, they kind of claim to speak for the faculty and represent the faculty. And so the faculty needs to keep the pressure on them to do that, rather than to be in the pocket of the administrator who appointed them. That's why I said toward the end of the presentation, you know, be wary of committees where faculty members are not elected by the faculty, or at the very least appointed by a faculty body. When administrators start to cherry pick faculty members for committees, and like I said, we saw this especially during COVID, for sudden task forces. We need a rapid response to this, so we need a task force, and I'm going to pick faculty members X, Y, and Z, and administrative officers A, B, and C, and throw them together, and they're going to do the work that was traditionally done by a standing faculty body. That's a recipe for the erosion of governance, of faculty governance. And so one way to counter it, like I said, is to, you know, to keep the pressure on those faculty members, to remind them that they're accountable to you as their colleagues, and not to the administration just because the administration appointed them. I think another way to try to counter it is to call the administration out on it, to say, you know, these we're glad you appointed faculty members, but they're appointees. That's it. They weren't elected by us, so they don't speak for us as faculty. They were appointed by you. We would have preferred that we elected our representatives to this committee, because then they would truly be representatives rather than appointees of the administration. They have far less credibility being appointees. And again, to echo something I said earlier, it really puts those faculty members too in an unfair position where they try to claim to be representing the faculty voice when they can't legitimately make that claim if they've been appointed by the administration rather than elected by the faculty.
Thank you. Well, I see we're reaching the end of our 90 minutes. I also see an exodus from the Zoom meeting. So
That's my fault.
no, I don't think so. I don't think so. I believe it was a very, very engaging conversation. And I am going to share my final screen with everybody. To say, first of all, I want to say thank you to Mike. It was very, very informative. I think I hope that the participants got some great value out of it. And we can use this as a continuation of a discussion that I think is important that we have about shared governance in the state. And for those of you who are participating and you'd like to provide us with any input about what you thought about this forum, or what you think about shared governance in general, or what you think about the Nevada Faculty Alliance, please feel free to email us at stateboard@nevadafacultyalliance.org. The address is on your screens. And if you're not a member, I'd be remiss if I didn't take an opportunity to do some recruiting. If you'd like to join NFA, either as a faculty member or as an associate, we do have members of administration who have joined us as associate to help support our work. They're non-voting members, but we appreciate their input as well and their engagement with us. There is a QR code that will link you with our application. So with that, I will say, and I'm seeing some great comments coming through, and I want to thank everybody for participating, and especially our friends from administration and the Board of Regents. We do appreciate you joining with us today too. So thank you, everybody. And that will be it. And we hope to have one more forum on question 1. We're working on the details now, but it's a little stickier due to the individuals that we want to invite. We have to work around some legal issues, and we're trying to work on that. So watch your mail for information on the next forum. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Michael, thank you. Take care.